The word existed before anyone knew what to call the music. Somewhere in Kingston in the late 1960s, something had shifted. The locked-in pulse of rocksteady was loosening. The bass was dropping lower. The rhythm guitar was cutting differently on the offbeat. And the dancers in the yards and the dancehall fans pressing close to the speakers could feel it in their bodies before they had a name for it. Frederick Nathaniel Hibbert, a young man from Clarendon, who had already survived the loss of both parents, 18 months in a Jamaican prison, and the ruthless machinery of the early Jamaican music business, put a word to it first. In the winter of 1968, he walked into a studio session with producer Leslie Kong and recorded a song called Do the Reggae. And just like that, without ceremony, without announcement, without anyone quite realizing what had happened, the word reggae existed. That the Oxford English Dictionary would one day trace the etymology of one of the most globally recognized music genres directly to Toots Hibbert is the kind of fact that sounds too clean to be true. But it is confirmed, multiple sources, multiple citations, the kind of documented historical footnote that gets chiseled into the historical record and stays there. Toots and the Maytals coined the name. Not consciously, perhaps, not with a plan to claim ownership of a genre's birth certificate, but the song was there. The word was there, and everything that followed, the Bob Marley albums, the island imagery, the red, gold, and green flags, the global diaspora of Jamaican sound, carries at its center a word that Frederick Hibbert first put on vinyl. He did not come from privilege. He came from Maypen, Clarendon, a parish in central Jamaica, known for its agricultural flatlands and its heat, where he was born on the 8th of December, 1942, the youngest of his siblings. His parents were both strict, Seventh-day Adventist preachers, deeply religious people who raised their children in the cadence of the church, the call and response, the physical release of gospel, the idea that your voice was not just a voice but a vessel. When both parents died while Toots was still a child, he became an orphan by the age of 11. He moved to Trenchtown, the working-class Kingston neighborhood that would also produce Bob Marley and Jimmy Cliff, and went to live with his brother John. Trenchtown in the late 1950s was not a place designed for childhood comfort. It was one of the most densely packed poor communities in the Caribbean, built on government housing estates that had been constructed in the previous decade, where zinc fences divided yards, where water was shared, where the sound systems that would define Jamaican music were already beginning to set up and shake the dust off the corrugated roofs. What the neighborhood gave you, if it gave you anything at all, was exposure to sound, to performance, to the idea that music was the most democratic art form available to people with nothing else. You didn't need instruments. You needed a voice. Toots had a voice unlike anything Trenchtown or Jamaica had heard before. It was at a Kingston barbershop sometime in the early 1960s that Frederick Hibbert met Henry Gordon, known to everyone as Raleigh, and Nathaniel Matthias, known as Jerry. 3 young men who could harmonize with the precision of gospel singers and the instinctive rawness of street corner performers. They formed a vocal trio. They called themselves the Maytals. The question of what Maytals actually means would trail them for decades. Hibbert himself, in later interviews, would say that it was a Rastafari term, a word meaning something close to do the right thing. But there are also accounts that trace the name back more simply to Hibbert's hometown of Maypen, a geographic root rather than a spiritual one. The accounts conflict, and Hibbert was not always consistent in the telling. What is certain is that the name stuck, that it sounded like something, that it carried weight. The mystery of the name's origin, whether it was a Rastafari declaration of principle or a young man's sentimental nod to the place that made him, was never fully resolved. It remains a small, stubborn ambiguity at the heart of a career that was otherwise relentlessly, unstoppably present. The Maytals began recording for producer Clement Cox's own Dodd at Studio One, the most important independent studio in Kingston in the early 1960s. Dodd ran a tight operation. He had the ears of the street. He knew what the sound system crowds wanted. He knew which harmony groups had real magic, and which were just copying what had worked before. The Maytals were not copying anyone. Their close harmony gospel singing, built on years of church training and street corner improvisation, was something that Dodd recognized immediately. He signed them. He put them in front of the Scatolites, the house band that was laying down the foundational rhythms of ska, and the results were immediate. At Studio One, the Maytals were competing for attention and airtime with another young vocal group, the Wailers, featuring Bob Marley, Peter Tosh, and Bunny Livingston. The accounts from that period are consistent. The Maytals were, at that moment, the more commercially successful act. Their close harmonies and Toots' raw, ache-filled lead vocals were drawing bigger crowds and more consistent chart success. The Wailers were still finding their sound. The Maytals were already arriving. After roughly 2 years at Studio One, the group moved through several producers, Prince Buster, then Byron Lee, each transition shifting their sound slightly, each collaboration adding new textures to what they were building. With Byron Lee, in 1966, they entered the first-ever Jamaican Independence Festival popular song competition and won it with an original song Hibbert had written called Bam Bam. It was the kind of national recognition that announced a group had arrived. They would go on to win that competition 2 more times, in 1969 with Sweet and Dandy, and in 1972 with Pomps and Pride, a 3-time championship that no other Jamaican act had managed. Then, in late 1966, the group's momentum was interrupted in a way that would define the rest of Toots Hibbert's story. Hibbert was arrested and sentenced to 18 months in a Jamaican prison on a charge of marijuana possession. He always disputed this version of events. His account, told consistently over the years, was that he was not arrested for marijuana, that he was in the wrong place helping to bail out a friend, and that the charge that landed on him was not the charge he deserved. The official record says possession. Hibbert's record says something more complicated. The truth, as is often the case in Jamaica's colonial-era legal system, may have depended on whose account was being written down and whose was being ignored. What is not disputed is what he produced inside. He sat with 18 months of confinement, of government-issued numbers, of the grinding institutional machine that reduces human beings to entries in a ledger. He wrote a song about it. He gave himself a prison number in the lyric, 5446, and built a song around the dehumanization of the experience, the bureaucratic absurdity of reducing a man to a sequence of digits, and the defiant assertion that the number does not define the man. 5446, that's my number, would become one of the defining songs of Jamaican music's early era. Not a protest song exactly, but something more personal and more lasting. A document of survival. A declaration that he had been processed, numbered, filed, and had come out the other side still himself. When Hibbert was released in 1967, the Maytals began working with Leslie Kong, a Chinese-Jamaican producer who ran the Beverly's Records label and who had an unerring instinct for what the Kingston streets wanted to hear. Kong's studio was alive with the musicians who would define the era: Jackie Jackson, Winston Wright, Hux Brown, Rad Bryan, Paul Douglas, Winston Grennan, the core of what became known as the Beverly's All-Stars. It was the most musicianly environment Toots had worked in, and the results came quickly. The song that changed everything was recorded in 1968. Hibbert had felt the music shifting around him. The stiff, strutting 2-beat of ska had been smoothing out into the heavier, slower lope of rocksteady, and now rocksteady itself was opening up into something else, something with more bass, more space, more room for the voice to breathe. He wanted to call it something. The word he reached for, spelled reggae in the original pressing in the Jamaican vernacular of the time, was either derived from streggae, a local slang term for a raggedy or ragged person, or from reggae, a Jamaican word meaning ragged or untidy clothes, or from some other local etymology that the linguists and music historians have never fully settled. What matters is the record. What matters is the day in 1968 when Do the Reggae was pressed and put into the hands of the DJs and the sound system operators, and the dancers who were already moving to the new beat. The Oxford English Dictionary would later cite this recording as the first documented use of the word reggae, the etymology of a genre, officially credited to Frederick Nathaniel Hibbert, the orphan from May Pen, who had survived prison, who had harmonized in Trenchtown yards, who had learned to make his voice carry the weight of everything. The late 1960s and early 1970s produced a torrent of material from Toots and the Maytals under Leslie Kong's direction. Pressure Drop, with its descending chorus warning and its rolling rhythm, became one of the most covered songs in the history of Jamaican music. Monkey Man, recorded in 1970, became the group's first significant international chart hit, reaching number 47 in the United Kingdom. Kong's ears were exactly right for this material. He understood that Toots's voice needed space, that the harmonies needed room to build and resolve, that the productions had to be loose enough to swing and tight enough to hit. Kong died suddenly in 1971. He was 38 years old. It was a loss that the Jamaican music industry felt like a physical rupture. Kong had been the steady hand behind some of the era's most important recordings, not just for Toots, but for dozens of other artists. For the Maytals, it ended the most consistently productive chapter of their career. The man who stepped into the gap was Chris Blackwell, the founder of Island Records, who had been operating between London and Kingston since the early 1960s, and who had built Island into the most important international conduit for Jamaican music. Blackwell had been watching the Maytals for years. In 1971, he signed them, and in doing so he made a decision that would shape the trajectory of their career, and more specifically, the public perception of Jamaican music globally. Blackwell restructured the band. The original Maytals vocal trio of Toots, Raleigh, and Jerry became the front end of a larger ensemble, the Maytals Band, a hand-selected group of first-call Kingston session musicians, including Jackie Jackson, Hux Brown, Paul Douglas, and Rad Bryan. This was the configuration that would tour internationally, that would stand on stages in London and San Francisco and Los Angeles, that would represent Jamaica to audiences who had never heard reggae played live at volume. The name was officially changed to Toots and the Maytals in 1972, foregrounding the frontman, centering the voice, making clear to international audiences exactly who was driving this sound. The Maytals were unlike anything else. Blackwell would say later, sensational, raw, and dynamic. He would also say, in a formulation that became one of the most often quoted assessments of Jamaican music's internal hierarchy, it was said that the Maytals were the Beatles to the Wailers' Rolling Stones. The comparison did not quite land the way it might have intended. The Beatles, after all, outperformed the Rolling Stones commercially, but the cultural memory of that era did not follow the comparison where it logically led. Bob Marley became the face of reggae to the world. Toots Hibbert remained, for most of that world, a second fact, confirmed, respected, but somehow peripheral to the central narrative. This is the shadow that ran beneath everything that followed. The man who named the genre did not become its most famous ambassador. That particular irony is embedded in the history now, unresolvable and permanent. The Island Records era produced the work that would define Toots and the Maytals' international legacy. Funky Kingston, released in 1973, was their breakthrough album in the United Kingdom and the United States. Music critic Lester Bangs, writing in Stereo Review, called it perfection, the most exciting and diversified set of reggae tunes by a single artist yet released. The album was not a single genre exercise. It pulled from soul, R&B, rocksteady, and the new reggae, and it was held together entirely by Toots's voice, which moved through all of those registers with a naturalness that made every transition feel inevitable. The comparison to Otis Redding that critics had been making for years was everywhere in Funky Kingston. The raw emotional directness, the feeling that every word was costing the singer something real, the way a melody was not just sung, but inhabited. Chris Blackwell, in his commitment to the band, arranged for Toots and the Maytals to be placed in context that no Jamaican act had accessed before. They toured as the opening act for The Who during their 1975-76 North American tour, a massive, arena-level exposure to rock audiences who were encountering reggae live for the first time. They shared stages with the Eagles, with Jackson Browne, with Linda Ronstadt. In the summer of 1975, they headlined alongside Santana at the Winterland Ballroom in San Francisco, one of the legendary venues of that era. On the 1st of October 1975, they were broadcast live on KMET-FM while performing at the Roxy Theater in Los Angeles, a broadcast that was later remastered and released as the album Sailin' On. The live Toots and the Maytals in this period were a different proposition from the recordings. The records were immaculate. Kong and Blackwell's productions gave them a clarity and control that suited international radio. The live shows were something else. Raw, physically overwhelming, the full band driving a groove that locked listeners in place, and above it all, that voice, massive, uncontrollable, the voice of a man who had lost everything more than once and had kept singing. He's the nearest thing to Otis Redding left on the planet. Robert Christgau wrote in Christgau's Record Guide in 1981, he transforms do re mi, fa sol la ti do, into joyful noise. It was the most accurate thing written about Toots Hibbert in that decade. The question of what to call him, of what category the man occupied, what name captured the group around him, had never been fully settled. His own account of the word Maytals had shifted over the years. Some accounts said Rastafari principle, others said birthplace. The ambiguity had never been resolved, and standing here at the peak of his powers, it still hadn't. The name carried whatever weight the listener brought to it. Reggae Got Soul, released in 1975, extended the momentum, and then, in the late 1970s, something happened that Toots himself could not have engineered. The British punk and ska revival brought his music back into the conversation in a new way. The Specials, the Coventry-based two-tone band who were reprocessing ska rhythms through the urgency of post-industrial Britain, covered Monkey Man on their 1979 debut album. The Clash, arguably the most significant British punk act of the era, covered Pressure Drop, Bob Marley's Punky Reggae Party, the song that declared the unity of punk and reggae against the establishment's hostility, name-hecked the Maytals alongside the Wailers and the Damned and the Jam and the Clash. In a lyric about musical solidarity, Toots' band was named in the same breath as Marley's own. By 1980, Toots and the Maytals had a catalog that almost no Jamaican act could match. They had songs that had survived, that had been adopted, that had traveled far from the Kingston studios where they were made, and they decided to make one of the stranger records in their discography. On the 29th of September 1980, the band recorded a live album at Hammersmith Palais in London, rushed the tapes to sound engineers, designed a record label, sent the masters to a factory near Leicester, assembled the finished product, and delivered it to Coventry, all within 24 hours. The goal was the Guinness Book of World Records for fastest album from recording to distribution. The album, Toots Live, was real. The achievement was real. The failure was bureaucratic. Island Records had not notified the Guinness Book in advance, as the record required. The achievement went unregistered. It would be 28 years before another act officially claimed that record. The original Maytals trio, Toots, Raleigh, and Jerry, split after 1981's knockout. The specific circumstances of the split are not well documented in the public record. The accounts available are thin on detail. What is confirmed is that the trio that had formed in a Kingston barbershop in the early 1960s, that had recorded at Studio One and Beverly's and Island, that had won 3 national song competitions and built one of the most durable catalogs in Caribbean music history, separated. Toots continued to record and tour as a solo artist through the 1980s. In 1982, a cover of the Maytals' Beautiful Woman reached #1 in New Zealand, confirmation that the songs were still alive, that they were traveling, that the catalog was continuing to work in markets the original band had never fully broken. Then in 1988, Toots released Toots in Memphis, a solo album that earned him his first Grammy nomination. The title was deliberate, a declaration of kinship with the Memphis soul tradition, with the rawness of Stax Records, with Otis Redding, with the America that had always heard itself in his voice, even when it didn't know his name. The Grammy nomination that Memphis earned him was the beginning of a late-career rehabilitation that the industry had not quite anticipated. Toots had been consistent through the 1980s, while reggae's commercial center shifted. Dancehall was rising. Digital rhythms were replacing live bands. The genre that Toots had named was changing into something he had not invented. But the work had accumulated. The catalog was deep. And in the 1990s, as the first generation of reggae listeners, who had come up on Funky Kingston and Pressure Drop, reached their 30s and 40s, interest in Toots and the Maytals revived. A new lineup of the Maytals formed in the early 1990s. By mid-decade they were touring again, appearing at Reggae Sunsplash, the annual festival that had become the Jamaican music industry's international flagship. In 1998, they performed alongside Dave Matthews, an image captured in photographs of Toots Hibbert and Carter Beauford and Leroy Moore sharing a stage, two musical generations that had nothing obvious in common, finding common ground in the same groove. In 2004, Hibbert appeared on Willie Nelson's Outlaws and Angels project. The following year, his band's album True Love won the Grammy Award for Best Reggae Album, his first Grammy win, at 62 years old, on an album built around collaborations with artists as diverse as Bonnie Raitt, Keith Richards, Eric Clapton, No Doubt, and Ben Harper. The album was a statement of arrival, or perhaps more accurately, a statement of recognition for something that had always been there. The music industry, which had handed the global reggae narrative to Bob Marley and the post-Marley dancehall generations, was finally saying formally what the musicians had always known. In 2010, Rolling Stone ranked Toots Hibbert at number 71 on their list of the 100 greatest singers of all time. Not greatest reggae singers, greatest singers, full stop. The company he was placed in, Aretha Franklin, Ray Charles, Sam Cooke, the voices that defined American popular music for generations, was precise and deliberate. His voice, rooted in the Jamaican church, shaped by Trenchtown, forged by Studio One and Leslie Kong, and the hard mathematics of survival, belonged in that conversation. In 2011, the BBC aired a full documentary about the band Reggae Got Soul, the story of Toots and the Maytals, with testimonials from Marcia Griffiths, Jimmy Cliff, Bonnie Raitt, Eric Clapton, Keith Richards, Willie Nelson, Ziggy Marley, and Chris Blackwell himself. The documentary's subtitle described it as the untold story of one of the most influential artists ever to come out of Jamaica. The word untold was doing real work there. For all the catalog, for all the confirmed historical weight, the full story of Toots Hibbert had somehow remained less told than it deserved. Then came May 2013 and the River Rock Festival in Richmond, Virginia. Toots was performing when a bottle was thrown from the crowd. It struck him in the head. He was taken to hospital. The injury was serious enough to force him to cancel several months of live shows. The man who threw the bottle, William the 100th, Lewis, was charged with malicious wounding and later pleaded guilty to a lesser charge. Before sentencing, Hibbert wrote a letter to the judge. "He is a young man," Hibbert wrote, "and I have heard what happens to young men in jail. My own pain and suffering would be increased substantially, knowing that this young man would face that prospect." The judge gave Lewis a 6-month sentence despite Hibbert's plea for mercy. The mercy the man who had served 18 months in a Jamaican prison extended to the man who had hurt him carries a weight that is hard to explain and harder to forget. It is the moment where everything, the gospel upbringing, the Trenchtown years, the Rastafari principle that Maytals was said to embody, the Christianity and the music and the philosophy, converges in a single act of extraordinary generosity. After the injury, Toots and the Maytals went quiet for 3 years. The hiatus was longer than anyone outside the organization fully understood. The head injury, the recovery, the the recalibration of what touring life still meant at 70 years old. These were the private costs of a public life. In 2016, they returned to the stage and began touring again. Hibbert's vocals appeared in Major Lazer and Bad Royale's 2016 collaboration, My Number, which sampled 5446, That's My Number, the prison song, still alive, still circulating, half a century after he had written it in a cell. On the 25th of July, 2018, Toots and the Maytals performed on The Tonight Show starring Jimmy Fallon, debuting a new original song called Marley, alongside their classic Funky Kingston. It was a remarkable television moment, a Jamaican band of 60-year legacy, playing their hit and playing a new song named for the musician whose shadow they had spent decades standing in, on American late-night television, as if the reckoning with that relationship was still ongoing. Now return, briefly, to the question the name carries, Maytals. If it means do the right thing, and Hibbert, across decades of interviews, insisted that it did, then the name was always a declaration of ethical intent. We are the people who do what is right, who hold to what is true, who do not bend. And there is a version of Toots Hibbert's life that makes that claim feel entirely earned. The man who survived prison and wrote a song about being reduced to a number rather than a name. The man who wrote Mercy into the record when a bottle was thrown at his head. The man who named a genre and never received the credit that the naming deserved. But there is also the version where Maytals points back to Maypen, to the place where he was born, to the parish heat and the church harmony, and the parents who died too soon. In that version, the name carries not a principle, but a geography, a specific place on the Jamaican map from which the whole improbable story begins. These versions are not mutually exclusive. People and the names they choose are usually carrying more than one thing at once. In August 2020, news filtered through Jamaica and through the global reggae community that Toots Hibbert was in hospital. He was in a medically induced coma. The circumstances, the COVID-19 pandemic was moving through Jamaica as it was moving through the world, were grim but not unusual in that terrible summer. The unusual thing was that it was Toots Hibbert, the man who had survived everything, who had been numbered and filed in a prison and come out singing, who had been struck in the head by a bottle and responded with mercy, who had been commercially overshadowed by the very genre he had named, and had kept working anyway, kept recording, kept touring, kept making music that deserved to be heard. On the 11th of September 2020, at the University Hospital of the West Indies in Kingston, Frederick Nathaniel Hibbert died. He was 77 years old. The band's Facebook page announced it the following morning. The Jamaica Gleaner confirmed it. Rolling Stone confirmed it. Every publication that had spent 50 years describing his voice as the most soulful in Jamaica's musical history now reported his death in the same terms it had always used to describe his life. He was the man who named reggae. He was the most soulful voice Jamaica ever produced. He was a reggae pioneer on par with Bob Marley. The Order of Jamaica that he had received in 2012 sat in his record. The Grammy that True Love had won in 2005 sat in his catalog. The Rolling Stone ranking, 71st greatest singer of all time, sat next to the names of Aretha Franklin and Sam Cooke and Ray Charles. And at the Oxford English Dictionary, in the entry for the word reggae, the etymology still reads as it has read since the scholars first fixed it in place, credited to Toots and the Maytals. The word belongs to a man who grew up in a Trenchtown yard after his parents died, who met his bandmates in a barber shop, who was stripped of his number and turned it into a song, who named a genre its name in 1968 and spent 50 more years proving it deserved one. That is the record. Every stone turned, every verified fact told. What lives in the music is what the music always carries. The weight of a life fully lived, the refusal to be reduced to a number, the persistence of the voice. The question that remains, the one Jamaican music has never fully answered, is this: could reggae have become what it became if the man who named it had also become its face? Did the world miss something irreplaceable by letting one man's shadow fall over another's? Or was it always going to be this way? The namer and the named, the voice and the icon, arriving in the same moment, but landing in different places in history's memory. The record does not say. Only you can decide.